Good evening, everyone. My name is Kamal Morrell. I am a co-founder of the Interact and Independent School Black Alumni Association. Welcoming everybody out this evening. Before we get started, we just wanted to take a moment of silence to reflect and gather ourselves, to think about everything that's gone on over the past few months, and just to center ourselves. So we'll do that now. Thank you. So I'm now going to pass it on to Jessica Golson, who will lead off.
Thank you, Kamal, and good evening, everyone. I'm Jessica Golson, a graduate of Germantown Academy and founder of the Interact and Independent School Black Alumni Association. I am here to welcome you to our panel this evening and also to inform you about our Alumni Association. The Interact and Independent School Black Alumni Association, or IISBAA, was founded in November 2019 by 5 graduates of our member schools to intentionally build community among Black alumni from Philadelphia area private schools, and also to act as advocates for students and their families who attend our alma maters. Well, we formalized what already existed as an informal network, and we are united by our specific experience, and we seek to use that commonality as the basis toward continued growth and improvement. Now, our co-founder, Brooke Hutchins, the engine behind this organization, will introduce us to the new civil rights era and begin our panel. Thank you.
It was July 2013 when George Zimmerman was found not guilty for the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. Alicia Garza and Patrice Cullors logged onto Facebook and wrote impassioned messages using the hashtag Black Lives Matter. By January 2015, following protests ignited over the fatal shootings of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner, absent any accountability by the police officers responsible, the American Dialect Society declared Black Lives Matter the word of the year. We must recall, however, the American Republic for years remained unlikely to acknowledge widespread discrimination against Black Americans, and to even utter the once controversial phrase, Black Lives Matter. For Black people, it has not gone unnoticed that it took a coronavirus lockdown and flawless cell phone footage of a police officer kneeling on the neck of George Floyd for America to pay attention and see that racial inequality and injustice remain a real problem in every sector of society. Still, the power of the overdue movement is undeniable. Amid the racial reckoning of 2020, companies ranging from tech titans, Apple and Google, to toy maker Hasbro Inc. announced new measures and initiatives to promote racial justice. Over 100 Confederate symbols were removed. Similarly, many building names, mascots, and other forms of symbolism were changed. The new civil rights era is still unfolding, and it is not yet clear what social and political transformations it will produce. Tonight, we will speak with 4 game changers in the tech, entertainment, sports, and academia to discuss their experience and what changes they'd like to see. If you have questions for our panelists this evening, please submit them using the Q&A button. I am now honored to introduce our moderator, Kirby Dixon. Kirby serves as a director of publicity for A&E Networks. She is one of the creators, producers, and co-hosts of A&E's original podcast, The Table is Ours, which explores how Black identity has informed, empowered, and fortified the lives and careers of Black people in every industry, including entertainment, sports, and politics. Kirby is an alumna of the Penn Charter School. Please welcome Kirby Dixon.
Thank you, Brooke, and good evening, everyone. I am so completely honored and thrilled to be here this evening and to have been asked to moderate this really incredible conversation. You know, this past year has been so tough for so many of us, and the conversation that we're going to have tonight is, to be quite honest, it's going to get real. It's going to be raw, but it's completely necessary. And if I've learned anything throughout my experience so far, it's that oftentimes transparency is one of the greatest tools to move us forward and in the right direction. So with that, I hope everyone listening today enjoys the conversation. You take something or two away from the conversation and share it with your prospective networks. And With that being said, I'd love to introduce our panelists to you today. So I will be reading their bios. You're in for a treat. So first up, we have David Gould. David is Chief Diversity and Impact Officer at Harris Blitzer Sports and Entertainment, an organization that includes sports and entertainment properties such as the NBA's Philadelphia 76ers and the NHL's New Jersey Devils. Prior to joining HBSE, Gould served as the Deputy Director for Community Engagement and Communications for Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney's Rebuild Initiative. David is a graduate of the Germantown Friends School. Welcome, David. Next up, we have Erica Armstrong Dunbar. Erica is a writer and a historian and currently teaches at Rutgers University, where she is the Charles and Mary Beard Professor of History. Her work focuses on uncomfortable concepts of slavery, racial injustice, and gender inequality. She is the author of Never Caught, the Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge, which was a finalist for the 2017 National Book Award. Erica is also a Germantown Friends School alumna and a parent. Hello, Erica.
Hi, Kirby. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Next up, we have JD Dillard. JD is a writer and director working in Los Angeles, California. Dillard's directorial debut, Slate, a science fiction crime thriller, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and sold to Blumhouse and WWE for wide theatrical distribution. In 2019, Dillard premiered his sophomore feature, Sweetheart, science fiction horror film, Sundance Film Festival, which was released digitally by Universal. JD is a graduate of the Penn Charter School. Shout out to PC. Hey, JD. And last, but absolutely not least, we have Morgan Ramsey. Morgan is a user experience researcher at Google, where she specializes in developing the research strategy to elevate underrepresented users' narratives in order to build excellent products. For more than 5 years, Morgan has scooped, conducted, synthesized, and socialized her qualitative and quantitative research studies to help stakeholders understand how products development can create systemic impact. Morgan is an alumna of Germantown Friends School. Hey, Morgan.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, guys. So we're going to delve right into the conversation. I'm excited to have you all here. I think you guys are incredible representatives of your respective industries. And with that, I just want to start off with a softball question. It's an easy question, but a really weighted question nowadays. And this year has been so tough. We've gone through so much. And these past 2 weeks in particular have been really challenging for our community. So I just want to start off with the question, how are you guys? How are you really? Morgan, you're top of my screen, so let's start with you.
Thanks for that question, Kirby. I think that's such a hard question. As you were saying, I guess the immediate answer is like you say, oh, we're good. But I don't think anybody is really good this year. I think we're trying. I think we're progressing and moving forward. Especially in the work that I do. I think I was kind of holding my breath with a lot of the work because I felt like I was advocating outside of work and within work. So now that things have calmed down, I'm doing better. So I'll just say I'm doing better.
I love to hear that, and thank you for your honesty. JD, you're next on my screen. How are you doing today?
I'm tired. I mean, good, but you know, I think if the past year and a half has proven to be anything, it's kind of shown us all the limit of our own exhaustion in so many directions. You know, that said, it's not without hope. But I think, yeah, so much of what the past year has been is just, you know, been a strange oscillation between hope and utter exhaustion. So today I'm somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. Whenever I get asked the question, exhaustion is almost the first thing that comes to mind. So I get that. Erica, how about you? How are you doing today?
I was actually surprised you asked and really happy that you did, because I don't think I actually sat down and thought about myself today. And I think that's one thing that we all know that we have to do, is to find a way to do some self-care, even when it doesn't seem like there's time or space. Like everyone else, I'm exhausted. Honestly, I think all Black people are exhausted right now, just real talk. But in addition to that exhaustion, I'm also, I'm somewhat optimistic. And I'm optimistic just because of the power that I've seen harnessed by young people in particular in this nation. So that I sort of know that the baton has been passed to the next generation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And last but not least, check in. Dave, how are you? How are you doing?
Yeah, thank you also for the question, Kirby. I really appreciate that, and also find myself quickly answering I'm good whenever I'm asked that, even if that is not the case. You know, I think my sentiments have sort of been captured already. I'll just put a little different spin on it. I think I teeter between exhaustion but also being energized. I think the energy that we've seen around the social and racial justice movement this year has definitely been created hope, as others have said. And I think that's kicked in some adrenaline at certain times when I am feeling that exhaustion. I will be lying if I said that I am nervous about both the level of endurance that I have and we collectively have to continue it going. But at the same time, I'm nervous that as we go forward and the world opens back up and we have all the distractions, and not just we, but the broader world and allies, how much this commitment is going to be sustained. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but remain energized and continue to be exhausted as well. Yeah.
Thank you for your honesty too, Dave. You actually throw me right into another softball question, and I'll stick with you. I think you can answer it. We've kind of gone through all of your incredible bios, very truncated versions of your bios, because you guys are so impressive and so decorated and doing such incredible work. But Dave, I guess on the opposite, now during this time, what does keep you motivated in your prospective industry? What keeps you going?
Yeah, I think those moments when I have felt like that rush of adrenaline or energy has really come from being seen in a way that I have not experienced in my life before this year. I think as Black people, most if not all of us can relate with the feeling of being gaslit your entire life, especially attending private schools and having close friends and family even who love you dearly and care about you, but can't really understand what you're going through and really can't wrap their head around or appreciate how it impacts you. And this year is the first time in my entire life that I felt that people other than Black people have truly understood or could understood more than they have in the past and really appreciated and acknowledged the things that we have gone through. And so that's been incredibly cathartic for me and something that keeps me going, because that's a fundamental change that I think we need to capitalize on and is really what gives me hope for the future. That's really what's motivating me right now.
Yeah, well said. Does anyone else want to answer that question? Morgan, JD, Erica, what keeps you motivated? What keeps you going in your lines of work?
I mean, I'd say, you know, there's an interesting thing happening, at least on the entertainment side, where, you know, I won't say that the floodgates have opened, but the floodgates are cracked. You know, there's a lot of Black stories that are able to be told right now, and I won't say that, you know, every single thing that's given a green light is done in sort of the goodness or equity of one's own heart. I mean, I think a lot of people are operating out of hipness or fear. But that said, for us makers, if you're able to get it made, you know, I kind of don't think twice about taking the opportunity to do so. But I think that we're finding a lot more of our stories are being pushed through, again, for those variety of reasons. But it is, at the end of the day, you know, when you see press release after press release of, you know, Blackface, Black creator leading, you know, these various projects, it definitely puts wind in my sails. So again, it's a complicated thing, but I think it is broadly and absolutely a net positive.
I'll also add to that, if that's okay. I think similar to that, my experience and my story going through Google is something that I hope nobody has to go through. It was overall pretty positive, but there were definitely challenges. And so what motivates me is that I'm making sure that I'm true to my mission and highlighting underrepresented voices and making sure that we are not going to have to go through the experience that I recently went through. So that kind of motivates me to continue to push on and continue to share my story and continue to highlight unheard voices and amplify them on larger stages so that we can create an easier pathway.
And I'll just add quickly, I think I have the honor and the obligation of capturing the stories of Black people and centering them in the American narrative. And I think we're in a moment right now where there's a bit of a sort of renaissance when we think about literature, history, poetry. I'm thinking about some of the fantastic memoirs, Kiese Layman, thinking about people like Imani Perry, who are really contributing to this broad and diverse world of Black storytelling. And I think that in many of the same ways that JD is talking about, at least in terms of sort of film and television, and I'm doing some of that too, that I take great comfort in world making and making certain that our stories are centered, are not marginalized. And I'm happy that it appears as though, as JD said, the door is cracked and we have some space to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Erica, I want to kind of stick with you because this is what this conversation is all about, right? We're getting to the meat of what this conversation, this panel is about. And kind of, it does seem like following the racial reckoning of summer 2020 that we're living through this new civil rights era, right? This renaissance that you touched on. So as a historian, can you kind of speak about and contextualize what we are experiencing now compared to previous Black movements? Like, what makes this movement unique? And do you also, as a historian, think we are living through a new civil rights era?
Yeah, I promise not to be a professor right now because, it's 7:19 on Thursday night or whatever night it is.
What is time anymore?
Exactly, what day, what time? As a historian, I'm like the worst person to ask, is this new, is exciting? Because I'm going to tell you, no, Black people have been fighting forever, right? We've been fighting since the 17th century when people are living in what they eventually called home in mainland North America, right? So I will say that as a historian, we see sort of moments, peaks of engagement, of resistance. And clearly we saw that at this sort of watershed moment. And the moment was long. It was the 50s and 60s, really, when we think about a traditional civil rights movement, when we think about legislation that was passed that changed really the ways in which Black people lived in this nation, moved through the sort of Black Power movement of the 1960s. That was a long movement, and I'd argue that it really hasn't been since that time period that we've seen a kind of sustained attack against anti-Black bias and racism. And what I see now is once again the sort of Black Lives Matter movement breathing new life in this call for humanity, because that's really what we're talking about, right? And I think one of the things that's happened during the sort of summer of 2020 into now is that we see that call for the respect of Black life spilling into other spaces as well. When we think about our Asian brothers and sisters who are calling for the same thing, who are being attacked and murdered in ways that are palpable and understandable within the Black American experience, I would argue that what is different about this moment is seeing the sort of the anger and the frustration spill into the streets in a global way. Because when we were watching the television in your phone or whatever it is, I'm the old one of the bunch, so I said television instead of my phone. But when we watched that coverage last summer, of people all through the streets here in the United States, in Rome, in places in Africa, throughout Europe, that was a moment where I said, okay, this is now a global movement, and we've got to figure out a way to sustain it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we a lot of times forget that this is not new. What we're going through is not new, but for a lot of young people, it is. This is the first time that we've ever experienced anything like that. So thank you for kind of contextualizing the moment we're living in. But it is a little disheartening that this isn't the first time that we've been going through something like this. I do want to ask everyone, maybe by a show of hands, when you guys first stepped foot in your industry, how many of the panelists today saw anyone that looked like them? One. What about in a position of power, a leadership position? Anyone at the top? That's crazy to me. That's wild. JD, I'm actually going to throw it to you only because to me, the media and entertainment industry is something where you would imagine everyone to see themselves represented, or you would hope. What was that like for you, stepping foot in an industry that's supposed to be really liberal and representative of the entire world, but not seeing anyone that looked like you as a director, as a filmmaker that you could kind of learn from?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a trip because, you know, I think what's been really interesting to both watch and experience over, and I will say the past 5 years, is, you know, a lot of the work that we as Black filmmakers and creators were, and I'll also put in air quotes, allowed to do was very specific. You know, I mean, coming into the business as someone who, you know, more often than not, like works with genre, science fiction, thriller, you know, my first scripts, there was always that thing that would happen where, you know, I got a meeting based off of my writing, and then, you know, there was kind of a double take when I came in. It was like, oh, the alien, okay, the alien thing was you, because, you know, a lot of where, you know, Black writers had found success was obviously not, and this is I'm speaking very broadly, but, you know, is in very specific aspects of the business where, you know, sort of the folks that buy and greenlight those things are comfortable with. So, you know, that's not to say that there weren't, you know, Black filmmakers or television creators or actors that I have always looked up to. But, you know, it's truly an issue of numerical abundance. I mean, you know, you come into a space and, you know, sure, 1 out of every 1,000 people is someone that looks like you. And that in its own right is disheartening. I mean, I didn't really have, you know, Black mentors or even like colleagues in a real way until probably the second half of my career. And that's, you know, not always for lack of trying, but just, you know, you get a job at a production company and you look around that production company and, you know, there's no one that looks like you. So, you know, as just with all of that, it's actually been, you know, while we still have a long way to go, and I was kind of talking about this in our opening, but you know, it has been kind of hopeful to just see more and more people that look like us, and on top of that, attacking a wide variety of work, you know, and that for sure is exciting.
Yeah, I think you and I had discussed this when we were all preparing for this panel, and there is a yearning in Hollywood for more diverse casts, right? UCLA just came out with a study in which they said that US audiences in particular do want more diverse casts in the television, in the films that they're consuming. So kind of wondering then, now that Hollywood has quote unquote woken up, do you feel like you're getting more opportunities that you've deserved all along?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's funny because it to a certain extent, I mean, it really boils down to like what each of us as an individual want to make, you know, and there are plenty of people who will, you know, build incredible careers telling stories of, you know, our civil rights heroes and making sure that those see the screen. On the complete other side of the spectrum, and these are not the only options, you know, there are folks who are going to put Black people in space, and like that's what they want to do. And, you know, sure, the themes and the metaphor may all be like allegorical to the things that we're experiencing today, but, you know, done through the lens of genre. So I I think that there are more, people are taking risks more often, and it's a shame that it has really taken like studies to show people that this myth that we shouldn't be the leading people in these stories, that's now being disproven. But I mean, I kid you not, until Black Panther, as Black creators, we were still always told like Black doesn't sell, so we need to figure out a way to like work around this. And it took that and then Get Out. People are like, well, maybe it sells, maybe it sells. These things only happen to make billions of dollars worldwide. But until numerical value could be associated with it in a sort of non niche kind of way, we were just told it was impossible.
Yeah, well,
Can I jump in on that, Kirby?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
I had an experience, I went, when I wrote this book, Never Caught, and, people automatically started asking how's it going to become a film? When, let's go, and had an agent, and still do, and all that. And I started taking these meetings, right? And so here I am, like an academic, a writer who is like going into what is bizarro world of Hollywood, to me, and quickly realizing that you're walking into these spaces, you're like, these people aren't necessarily all that smart, but okay, so we're going to have this conversation. And I was literally told, I won't say by whom, but I was in a very well-known agent's office who told me that I would never be able to do anything with Never Caught because Black people only go see horror movies and comedies. Now, this was in 2017. Okay. So I thought, well, Never Caught is probably not going to be adapted by Tyler Perry with Medea starring as Ona, right? And it's not a horror movie. But I remember walking out of that office and thinking, how many other creatives have encountered that person, those gatekeepers who have decided what and how we will tell the stories of Black people across time and space in this nation? And to understand that these gatekeepers, and they are gatekeepers, are very real. That it was making me think about JD's comments that now we're seeing, because of protest, because of people saying, the Oscar's so white, and as well as the Me Too movement, right? That sort of kicked in some doors and said, wait a minute, the way things have been happening can't happen anymore in that fashion. We've got to change, and change takes time and is slow. But once again, one of the things that makes me optimistic is hearing JD talk about how there's movement.
Yeah, I think one of the things you touched on that I talk about a lot with one of my friends at work is this idea of imposter syndrome, right? Where a lot of times it infiltrates the Black community more than any other community, and we never feel like we're enough, or we're afraid to showcase our talents in the rooms. And I think the moment we kind of get rid of that and out of that mindset, because many times we are the smartest, most creative people in the room, it'll allow us and open up more doors for us to be able to do whatever it is that we want to do. Dave, I want to touch and throw that question to you really quickly too, because you're in sports, and it's crazy to me that you haven't been able to see someone before yourself at the top to really emulate and look up to in an industry that really kind of capitalizes off of Black talent. So can you talk about that?
Yeah. And, I'm actually relatively new to the industry. I came over here about a year ago. And we do have Black executives. Somebody who I look up to has actually been instrumental in the adoption of this work for the 76ers, Elton Brand, our GM. And to your point, Kirby, we are in the NBA, we are a predominantly Black league. I think we're like 80% Black in terms of our players. And we have Black vice presidents, things like that. But at the C-suite level, on the business side, I'm the only, outside of Elton, I'm the only Black member of the executive team. It's this point, so I don't have anything to compare it to before this summer, just because of when I joined. One thing that I am definitely grateful for is that I think we're probably one of the more progressive teams in terms of our commitment to racial and social justice and diversity. And there's things that we need to work on, and we are working on those. But I definitely have colleagues who have had a much steeper hill to climb, so to speak. I think the challenge for me is, regardless of how committed we are to a cause, and it goes a little bit to your comment about imposter syndrome, is even though I've been given much more I don't know, freedom to be candid and really speak my mind and speak my experience, and also elevate the experience of others, I have 32 years of lived experience that tell me that I need to bite my tongue in rooms like that, right? And so I have a daily struggle with, like, how honest am I going to be, and how am I going to pick and choose my words and my points and different issues that I may raise, and what I'm going to advocate for. And that's actually not an indictment on the individuals that I am working with, but I think it's more so an indictment on the system and the culture that I've been raised in our country, in which case, like, we have been trained and conditioned to bite our tongue because we have lived experience to say that most people are not going to be receptive or understand where we're coming from. And so I think that's like a microcosm of where we are more broadly, which is we have made progress, but we still have a long way to go. And not the only thing, but one of the things that's going to help with that is to make sure that there are more people who look like us in those rooms. So you do have allies and advocates, and it's not just coming from one person.
Agreed. Thank you, Dave. Morgan, I want to bring you into the conversation, right? So you've been at Google since you were an intern, and I feel like Google is one of those brand names that when someone says they work at Google, eyes pop out and everyone is completely in awe that you're at that company. So for anyone that may not know, can you kind of briefly explain what a user experience research, what it is, and how does your role specifically drive equitable outcomes in the tech industry?
Yes, definitely. So it's okay if you don't know. I feel like a lot of people don't know. So I'll break it down as I can, kind of how I told my parents. So UX research stands for user experience research. And essentially we're the people who are in a design org, and we make sure that the product is working well as intended. It's really thinking about not just, is it working well by metric systems and all that, but what are people saying about our product? How are they using it? Can they communicate with it in the way that we're expecting or intending? For example, if you want to speak to Siri or something, it's not picking up what you're saying because of your dialect or because of your accent, all of those are incorporated into a user's experience with the product. The way that fits in with the broader structure is that there's kind of like a triad. So there's the business side that talks about the business needs and requirements. Then there are the engineers who build it. And we're like right in between that, the design org, to figure out what it should look and feel like before we build it and ship it out. How my role has pertained and kind of worked into equity, I sit specifically on the equity engineering team, and that sits within corporate engineering. So I'm in the engineering org, but a design kind of like part of it. And our goal is to make sure that the tools and the systems and the processes that we're building for Googlers, so all internal, are keeping equity at the forefront of it. So I'm a researcher, so I use a lot of like psychology and all different types of, I borrow from different academia and different papers to figure out what methods we're going to use to make sure we're creating an equitable product. We partner a lot with HR and DEI in that space. We also partner a lot with engineers as well. So like I said, we're kind of that liaison and making sure that we're bringing equity in the beginning versus what it usually is we'll build a product and everybody's like, oh shoot, let's think about Black people. I don't know, let's think about how it's gonna work for other people. We got to go back and refigure this whole thing out. Our whole thing is, no, let's think about that in the very beginning so we don't have to come back to it or make it a side project and really bake it into just the overall life cycle of a product.
That's really cool and really necessary. So thank you for that. I do want to stick with you for a second though, because even at the beginning of this panel, you had mentioned that you hope that moving forward for Black women, period, Black people, period, they don't have to go through the struggles that you've gone through as you've been building a career in the tech industry. And I feel like it's no surprise, everyone knows the tech industry is predominantly white. it's predominantly Asian, it's predominantly male. So it's very rare, unfortunately, to see a Black woman thriving in the tech industry. So I want to ask how you kind of navigated that environment and made the role that you currently have a role that suits you, and where you feel like you can bring your full best self to work each and every day.
Oh yes, I'll try to make this as brief as possible because it is a story. But it all started, I went to Duke and I was a public policy major. And so I was really, and have always been really interested in policy reform. And I knew I wanted to do something with advocacy when I graduated. And at Duke, there was kind of this clause within being a policy major where you have to do like an internship to study a specific policy. And so I was looking at birthright citizenship in Haiti and looking at Haitian Dominicans and how their rights to birthright citizenship were revoked in 2008. And I could have kind of stopped there and just like read and wrote papers on it. But instead, I really wanted to hear from people who are experiencing it themselves. So I went to the Dominican Republic. I did a lot of studies and research there, partnered with local NGOs. And at that point, when I was at Duke, I said, this is what I want to do. I don't know what it's called, but I want to go down. I want to talk to people. I want to get those insights and bring it back to an NGO to say, hey, this is what people are saying. It's not just enough to look at a spreadsheet and say, these are all the metrics. These are the anecdotes. These are what people are experiencing with our product or our process. During that time, I also was doing an internship with Google. So I did 2 internships, but they were both in HR. And at the end of those internships, I let Google know, this was right before I was going to graduate too, like I'm really interested in continuing with Google, but I want to be more where my training is. I'm a policy major. Then became the politics of Google of like, well, we can let you in, you've done 2 internships, but you have to go into HR. There's really no other way that you can go in. But they didn't tell that to every other intern that was in the program. So there's of course like discrepancies there, but I knew what time it was. Like I knew like if I wanted to get into Google and I knew if I wanted to continue to brand myself or like grow my brand, I had to get in the door. And then once I was in, I could kick the door open. So I said, okay, in my mind, I'll play this little game. So I'll go in and I was in HR, but I knew from day one that I needed to first focus on brand or building my network. If there's anything Google gives you, it's a network. So I started talking to people like, this is what I want to do. How do I get here? Starting to grow my role and connecting with different people within the industry and within the HR world. Then I decided that, okay, this role is great, but I need to do more. So I actually moved to Ireland because it was random. And I thought it was also the headquarters for Google Europe is in Dublin, Ireland. And I was really, really interested in getting a different perspective of Google. And when I came back, I collected all of that. I had really strong sponsors and mentors, and I knew it was time for me to create a role for myself because Google wasn't going to just hand me a role. I had to kind of scope it myself. So that was 3 years of kind of being very strategic about my role. And then in my final couple of years, it just was a lot of negotiating, getting offers other places, letting Google know, and kind of going through the politics of moving from the HR non-tech world into the tech world. So it's kind of just a snippet, but it's essentially the journey that I've been through, which was pretty difficult, pretty challenging. It was a 4.5-year journey, but it for sure was rewarding at the end of it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Also, shout out to you for traveling all over the world. That's amazing. Guys, we're already zooming through this entire conversation, so I'm going to start to move us along a little bit. Erica, I want to ask you though, the Civil Rights Movement led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Again, as a historian, kind of what do you believe will be the outcome of this moment, or more specifically, what do you hope is the outcome of this moment for Black people specifically?
Okay, that's not a softball question.
I know.
I mean, I think that I know what my hopes are. And then I think about what I believe will actually happen. And I think that those are 2 different things. Call me cynical or call me somebody who's just a student of history. I'd like for us to live in a nation where I don't have to be scared that my now 16-year-old boy drives my car and I'm terrified every time he does it. I'd like to live in a nation where we aren't the only ones in our fields, or having to take specific kinds of positions in order to, that are given to us because of who we are. I'd like for there to be some federal policy, because I think the one thing that's been very clear and that we know from history, from the 1950s and 60s, is that when we leave it to the state level, it won't happen, especially in specific locations throughout this country. And when we think about the number of lawsuits right now that are attacking the right to vote, and specifically for Black and brown people throughout the nation, questioning, shutting down poll places, questioning mail-in ballots, we understand that this is a very familiar tactic, right? To me, it's like asking me to come up and recite the Constitution before I'm allowed to vote, or asking me how many bubbles are in the sea, which is what we know people were asked in the 50s and 60s or before that, and to prevent them to vote. And so my hope is that there's federal legislation in place, federal executive acts that make people accountable. And you said in the beginning of this conversation that it was going to get real, and the first place that it needs to happen is with law enforcement. And the one thing that I say over and over again, there's lots of talk about gang violence and what have you. Law enforcement is the biggest gang in the nation. And until we find a way to crack that code, until we find a way to hold law enforcement accountable and not give them a pass. Yes, we saw the Chauvin verdict last week, and I am grateful that maybe George Floyd's family will have some peace or find some closure. That was one case. And I think we all know how many happened since then, since that week. I've lost count. And so for me, I think the thing that I want to see in my lifetime is for law enforcement to be held accountable, and for me not to be scared to dial 911 for fear that they're going to shoot me if I have a problem, if someone's breaking into my home. So I think really that's one of the major issues. If we're talking about civil rights, it's voting and law enforcement.
Yeah, thank you for that. And like I said, exactly what you said. We said at the beginning of this conversation that it's going to be a tough one. It is going to get real, and that's a very real sentiment across a lot of our community. So thank you for saying that. I want to kind of move us into a space where we're talking about our mental health, right? Erica was kind of speaking about a little bit our resistance is, or our anti-racism is facing resistance, right? So we've seen the insurrection on the Capitol. We saw the response to Black Lives Matter being, well, Blue Lives Matter, and not understanding what the actual sentiment in words Black Lives Matter means. And I want to throw this to anyone in the group. I'm looking at you, Dave, but if you don't want to answer it, that's totally fine. So how can we, as professionals, as Black professionals in our various industries, counter the resistance that we might be facing while also protecting our mental space, protecting our jobs, quite frankly? Because I know from my perspective, in similar to what you said, sometimes I bite my tongue and I don't like that. But sometimes for the protection of my role, I feel like I cannot speak up, even though that may not be the sentiment that I'm actually feeling.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I will definitely admit that is something that I am still working through. I'll just speak from my own personal experience. One of the things that I struggle with is, and granted, like I absolutely love my job. Like being able to do something that I'm passionate about for the 76ers is like an incredible privilege. At the same time, there are these issues and events that, as we all know, weigh very heavily on us mentally and emotionally, that it's my responsibility to deal with them at work, right? And also create safe spaces for others, because they're going through the same thing. And I sort of bear that weight on my shoulders of trying to make sure that we're creating a space that everybody can bring their whole selves to work and is given the grace and flexibility to take care of their own mental and emotional health. So it is, it's a challenge for everyone. I think at work, and this is also a privilege for some of us, depending on where we work. But aligning yourself with people who have a shared experience, I think goes a really, really, really long way. I'll never forget, like I think it was the morning after Philando Castile was shot. I was working at a nonprofit organization. I was one of 2 Black people on the staff. I was the only Black male on the staff, and everybody went into work. And it felt like just another day at work. And I was like going through it. And I closed my office door and I like cried 3 times. And I think at that point in my life, I've become a little bit more emotional as I've gotten older. But like at that point in my life, like I couldn't remember crying since I was like a young adolescent, more than like twice. And it was because I had this feeling of like being isolated and lonely. And one thing that's so different from now than, relative to then is I now work at an organization where I'm working with more Black people than I've ever worked with in my life. And we're not a predominantly Black organization, but it makes such a difference. And so again, I know that that's a privilege because not all of us have that in our workplace. But if there are opportunities for you to find that with others when you are feeling isolated, and thank God we now have social media and cell phones and things like that we can be at work and reach out to other loved ones or friends or family like that. To me, that's my grace, is like it's an outlet that I've really needed. That there was definitely a moment in time where I didn't feel that, at least in my immediate workplace. So it's the best I got right now.
No, that's good. Thanks for sharing. I always say you can't be what you can't see. So really proud, and shout out to all of you guys for being that person that someone sees that's coming up after you. JD, I want to ask you a question now, because knowing who the audience is, right? We all graduated from really good schools, really privileged schools, right? That educationally prepared us to go to good colleges, to get good jobs, and to really excel in the classroom. But we're learning now, we've probably known the entire time, that that's not all that's needed to be a successful professional in the workplace. There's some things that can't be taught in the classroom, but need to start at home. And that's things like empathy, anti-racism, compassion, patience, perspective, all of these things. So as a Black alumni of this community, I want to ask you, what resources or assistance would you have liked to see or would like to see our groups in our schools provide to students of color that you may not have received when you were in school?
Yeah, I mean, look, as a C- student, I can definitely speak to this with some clarity. But no, I mean, look, it's so strangely tied to a piece of what I was talking about already, which is just that, that our educators also allow us as Black students the sort of breadth and diversity of interest that all students are given. I mean, and without it being really tied to very specific people, there is just a general feeling I have in parts of my academic experience where it's like, I want to do this thing, and there was a hiccup when I said that thing. Now on one end, I take some of it with a grain of salt, because being 15 and telling people you want to be a film director, I mean, race aside, there is a lot of wish fulfillment required to get to that point. But I think it's you grow up, and a lot of the white folks to your left and right are you hear and see the you can be whatever you want when you grow up, and in strange ways I don't think we are always afforded that same dream. And again, that I have felt that same feeling translate into my professional life again, as it's like, well, I want to make this science fiction thing. It's like, oh, well, you know, how black is it? It's like, well, I mean, it is black because I am black and I'm going to tell it through that lens. But the story does not have to be based in my trauma, you know, which, and again, to even go back to a little bit what you were asking David about with mental health and just the most minor seg. I mean, it's why, you know, to stand on this very specific soapbox of, you know, type of work that's important to me, you know, Black wish fulfillment lives at the center of everything that I create. And that is not to say that, you know, stories of our trauma do not, you know, necessitate a point of view or a stage. But I think to sort of also counter program what our waking experience is, you know, it is sort of my crusade to give us more Miles Moraleses, to give us more, you know, more of our faces as heroes, more of us in big genre, because I do think on two ends, it's important to force down everyone else's sort of throat that we deserve to be the heroes as well. And in tandem with that, I think to being 11 walking down the aisles of Toys R Us, you know, looking at action figures, and it's like, cool, there's like a wrestler, Lando Calrissian from Star Wars, and okay, those are the only action figures. And not to, you know, reduce it quite to you know, product commercialism, but you know, to speak to the broader point, you know, we need to be in these bigger stories. We need to be vanquishing the villains. We need to be, you know, the kings and queens on top of the mountain. We need to be killing the dragons. We need to be blowing up the Death Star, and all of that I think is centered in Black wish fulfillment.
Amen to that. Thank you for sharing. Guys, I just want to remind anyone listening in, we're about 5 to 10 minutes from when we're going to open it up to Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to just throw it in the chat and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. But for the panelists last section, I want to talk about what's next. I want to talk about where do we go from here. I want to talk about what key takeaways do we want anyone listening in to walk away with. And so one of the questions that has been burning on my mind, because a terminology that we hear all the time is the idea of allyship, right? And a lot of us we went to predominantly white institutions, we occupy predominantly white spaces, we are employed by predominantly white organizations. So Dave, I'm going to throw this one to you. How important is allyship in your opinion? And what does good allyship even look like?
Yeah. So one is that like allyship is a fundamental prerequisite for any like broad systemic change. To Erica's earlier point, like we as Black people have been fighting for this for centuries, and we are still dealing with this. We are not, you know, fundamentally in the position of power, and so it's not going to be something that we should be expected to, or frankly, I believe can change on our own. You know, I think something that we've actually started to talk more about internally, and I got to credit my colleague for this, for framing it this way, Lexi Williams, is that like allyship is something that is earned. It's not something that you can, you know, it's not a title that you can bestow upon yourself. It's got to be earned through action. And I think we need to be intentional about holding others accountable who view themselves as allies, and making sure that they are actually acting on that belief that they are in fact allies. So, you know, that looks a lot of different ways. I fundamentally believe that like, as we try to break down these issues, it's about your interpersonal interactions. It's about calling people out when you're in rooms that all the folks on this panel are not in. It's also about like, you know, marching and speaking out and donating and all those great things as well, and advocating. But I think that a lot of this work is like the intangibles, and it's going to be like there's the phrase death by 1,000 cuts. I think it's like success by 1,000 cuts. It's all the little things that you do or don't say, at various points in your day. And so allyship is like all of that wrapped into, that's sort of like my definition, and it's more of a feeling. But I think we need to make sure that we're holding others accountable to allyship and not granting it, so to speak, so easily.
Yeah, does anyone else want to talk about what allyship looks like to them? If not, I have a question to close us out with before we open it up to questions. All good, totally fine. Guys, knowing what the audience is and everyone that's listening into this room, and knowing that you guys are game changers in your respective industries and respective fields, one thing that I'm really big about is that once the doors open, you're making sure you're pulling somebody else up and keeping the door open for other people to succeed. And I'm wondering from each of you, I'll start with you, Erica, if there's one key takeaway that anyone listening in could walk away with from this panel regarding representation in your field or in life, what would you say to that?
Yeah, well, I think that, I have the good fortune, as I said, of being the elder of the group. And we've all sort of come from this independent school background. I have the honor of also now being a parent with a son at Germantown Friends School. And I think that what we can take away from our comments tonight, our experiences shaped by the schools that we've attended, and also now watching the same sort of issues and problems confront my son, and this is like 30 years later, I think it tells us that we still have a lot of work to do, right? And that while I am super optimistic about this next generation that's like, I don't know, shutting down Trump campaigns on their phones or whatever it is that they're doing with TikTok and all kinds of things. I do think that generationally, there is a really big chance for transformation. We're not there yet. I think we're moving in that direction, but I think the one thing that we all know, and this is maybe the sort of basic answer, is that there's still a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely. Morgan, I'm going by who I see on my screen. How about you?
I'm trying to figure out just one thing to go through, but I think definitely, I don't know if y'all have seen I'm only partway through watching them because I don't really like scary movies, so I'm going slow. But in the first episode, there's a scene where the Black family moves into the white neighborhood, and the white neighborhood kind of like gathers around the one Black house, and everybody's just like looking at them. That's how I felt going through this entire experience, trying to get from HR into the engineering field. And it always felt like, oh, maybe I should take a step back, or my recruiter saying, oh, you can't do this. Like, you have to have this, you have to have this. I don't have a PhD or even a master's degree. And everybody on my team has that or more. And so I always felt like I wasn't enough. I also kind of have a little bit of a love-hate with the word like imposter syndrome, but that was always kind of circling around in my mind. But since I've gotten here, what I tell people that I mentor and other people, just my friends, is that you shouldn't listen to what people are saying is not possible. I know it's kind of like a cop-out answer, but I genuinely feel like if I had listened to the HR folks, had I been kind of intimidated by the stares I was getting on the engineering floor, because, the HR floor was in the other building and everybody was like, why are you going to this building? Had I been kind of deterred by that type of pressure or questioning or kind of like critique, I wouldn't have been able to make it to the space. And so I guess my takeaway is to believe in your abilities and your capabilities, and know that with ambition and with networking and being strategic, you can get pretty much everywhere that you want to be. I know it's kind of easier said than done, but I definitely would say not to listen to what other people think or say if they're trying to deter you from your path, because you can't make it.
I love that. I'm going to come back to you, Morgan, because I see a question in the chat about networking. Dave, you're next. What's a takeaway that you'd like everyone to walk away with?
Yeah. You know, I think that the biggest thing is that, like, as we move forward, like, we've been given space to be candid, as I was speaking about earlier. And I think something that's key to making sure we sustain this momentum is to do actually the opposite of what I was saying earlier, where I feel like I still need to bite my tongue because, you know, that's my natural instinct based on my lived experience. And I think we need to cut that out. I think we've been given space to be really honest and open. Sometimes explicitly space that was created for us. And I think we've been more comfortable in creating our own space as well over the course of the past year, at least I have. And I think that's something that we need to continue to build on and expand. Like JD said, the floodgates aren't open, they're cracked. And I think that's one of the keys to continuing to open those gates up.
Awesome. Say it loud, be Black and be proud, right? JD, how about you to close us out before I open it up to Q&A?
Yeah, I mean, funny enough, I think my feeling is kind of this, like a weird hybrid of Morgan and David's, which is, you know, I think when you arrive into a space, and in many times solely based on your Blackness, you know, the suggestions you get, the advice you get, the direction you're pointed in is so oftentimes predicated on where they think you should be, has very little to do with what you want to be or where you want to be. So it is both this, like, you know, you have to make your own space and obviously, you know, take advice with a grain of salt because it is often shaded with things that have nothing to do with you. And that is certainly a piece that I have felt in my world. So yeah, I mean, it is this, like, yeah, it is this hybrid of, you know, say it loud, say it proud, because I mean, that is your point of view. And especially in my line of work, I mean, you know, your voice is your livelihood. And, you know, on the flip side, yeah, it's not letting them tell you where to work from. So yeah, I'll kind of steal both of Morgan and David's and roll it in that.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for sharing. We do have about 8 to 10 minutes to answer some questions from the audience. Morgan, I said I was going to throw it back to you, so I'm going to do that. And one of the questions from the audience is, how do we improve the job networking system for ourselves and our community? And you're talking about how important it was to network. And I think Issa Rae even said, let's network across, not always up and down, but networking with your peers is just as critical. So how would you recommend?
Well, that's a good question. I think, okay, so I guess when I began my first couple of days at Google, everybody talks about networking, and there's kind of like that feeling like you have to go into a room and not know anybody and kind of have your little glass and stand by the side and like do that kind of traditional classic work of networking. I honestly feel like it just starts with building genuine relationships, like with people on your team, reaching out to know what people do. That's how I started. So when I started, I had like a coffee chat, is what we called it at Google, with maybe 1 or 2 people a week just to learn what they did. I didn't want anything from them. I just want to learn from them, learn about their experience and be like, okay, that's interesting. And then once I built up to connecting with people, keeping in touch, kind of just saying like, hey, nothing, again, not wanting anything, just kind of getting to know other people genuinely. Then when I became more strategic, I started to align, okay, what is my mission that I want in life and how can I get there? That's a very long stream thing to think about. But my next step was to think about, at least internally, what team is most related to the role that I want. And so I did a lot of research internally, again, talking to a lot of people like, this is what I want to do. If not you, can you connect me or tell me who I should look up or give me a resource or point me in a direction where I can learn more? And so I guess the second part to that is, if you do kind of have an inkling of what you want to do and you're kind of building those genuine relationships, then try to map out what would be the next step that will get you closer to that by asking other people their thoughts on it. So I know it's I don't know if that answers the question, but I think in terms of networking, maybe take away that kind of anxiety that might come up with thinking that it has to be cold calling, and instead really just getting to know people, reaching out. It could be anybody from, you never know who somehow somebody can bless you and how you can bless somebody else. And it doesn't have to just be, let me reach out to the director, let me get a sponsor so they can get me this job. It really can be, let me just be a good person to this person, or let me be a good friend. And you never know how it comes back around. So that was always my strategy going with it. It's like, let me just get to know people, and eventually it worked out.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, look, you have a panel of, including myself, 5 people, and I'm sure would love to connect, especially with the young people on this call. So, and we're only one person, but our networks and our communities span all different types of industries. So right now you have education, tech, sports, entertainment, media, but I personally know people in all different types of industries. So always happy to connect that way too. I have another question. This is from a junior at Penn Charter, so I'm calling them out. This question is for all the panelists, or we don't have a lot of time, so maybe one person can answer, but from your personal perspective, how specifically did or didn't your school prepare you for the industries you work in today? Anyone have a passion to answer that question?
Yeah, I can go ahead and just throw something out, which has actually been consistent throughout my career, which is one thing actually that I'm really grateful that GFS like bestowed on me was like an incredible level of comfort to be around well-educated and wealthy white people. Like it has actually been like incredible to just be in certain rooms and be able to be comfortable communicating when I know that a lot of people who come from my background do not have that level of comfort, and it can be fairly intimidating. And so that's something that has given the industries and the rooms that I've been able to and had to operate in. Interestingly enough, that's actually been something that has been very helpful. Yeah.
That's a great answer, and I totally agree with that. There's a level of comfort that I think I had going into the corporate America and the corporate space that a lot of my colleagues did not. And it was like a CEO, and I would be like, it's just the CEO, more so than trying to shy away from being seen in that way. Another question that we have is, okay, for Morgan and Erica, thinking about the civil rights movement, we now know that Black male leaders did not always get it right in terms of really supporting and backing the leadership of Black women. Thinking about that, in what ways can Black men, even those on this panel and in this Zoom as a whole, support your leadership and the leadership of women in this new civil rights movement? That's a heavy question, but a great question.
Oh, right on with a great question. I'll jump in, Morgan, and be quick. You know, I think one of the things is very clear about at least BLM is we know that, you know, the sisters are out front, at least in terms of organizing it and sustaining it. That's not saying that brothers aren't involved, but we know that the history of movement always has sort of Black women as major participants and organizers, but not necessarily out front, right? In positions of kind of known leadership. I think what's so great about this moment is that there's less of a sort of one single leader, like one Martin Luther King Jr. It's more organic, it's more sort of decentralized. And I think what that does is it gives space and entry for Black women in particular and Black girls, because, you know, this is a movement that's adults and children as well, that gives them sort of space to enter. And I think you know, I'm impressed and hope that we continue to see as much interest and an investment in protecting the lives of when we think about sort of the murders that Black people have had to deal with over the past year or two in particular. And when we think about the carceral state, we typically think about Black men. And I think we're turning that left a little bit and saying, hey, we got to think about the girls and the women who are behind bars, right? Who are living lives without their families, who are murdered in their beds at night, in their homes, that we know that there has to be a sort of egalitarian approach in leadership and the issues that we deal with in the civil rights movement. So, you know, and I'm also one, I'll just say it, I don't care how you identify in terms of gender, that this is going to take all of us and from whatever background you sit in to fight this beast.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Mahalia Jackson was the one who even started Martin Luther King on his I Have a Dream monologue. So let that be known. And last but not least, we only have a few minutes before I'm going to throw it to Natalie to close us out. But this question comes from Destiny. Knowing what you all know now, what would you do for your younger self in attendance at whatever school it was that you went to? What changes would you make or not make to ensure you were whole and intact through your entire private school journey? Since we have just a few moments, does anyone want to take it? JD, I'm looking at you, but if anyone else has an interest in answering that question, I'll welcome it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the fatal flaw I made in my academic experience was not better utilizing community. You know, it's very easy to slip into that when you are already so severely outnumbered, and even the gentle nudge to, you know, utilize that more, you know, seek people out, you know, build that early and robustly. I think that's the key piece. I would, if I could go back in time and, you know, speak to myself in 2003, like that's what I would have done, because community in that regard is not something that I really found until, you know, college and on. And yeah, I mean, I think it was an enormous missed opportunity socially, emotionally, spiritually to not lean into that more when I was in school. So I know that probably doesn't apply to everyone, but that's certainly, yeah, when I look back at my academic experience, I think that's the thing that rings loudest.
That's amazing. And Morgan, I'm going to throw it to you as our GFS representative.
Yes, I'm glad you passed it to me, because I was going to add slightly on to that. So for background context, I graduated from GFS, but I went to Springside, what was called Springside then, in middle school, and then GA in lower school. And I think what stood throughout all three of those schools, and it's much less of what I would have done, but what I really appreciated was watching how my parents advocated so much for me and my sisters. Whenever there was some type of discrepancy or racism that came up, they were always there. There was always some teacher saying that I didn't deserve this A, or some teacher saying that I hit the girl when I was just defending myself. There was so many stories between me and all my sisters. And every year there was some type of conversation, but just watching how my parents would advocate for me and my sisters so eloquently, and just the conversations they would have, and just the way they moved in a room. I wish I would have, I did see it when I was younger, but I was younger, so I wasn't that interested in it. But knowing now where I am, I'm so grateful that I had that model to fight for me, because I truly feel like that's what fueled me to be able to fight for myself at Google, and at Duke too as well, and beyond. So I just think that, I know that's not everybody's story. Everybody doesn't have parents that are able to do that for them, but that's something, whether it's a parent or just a friend, or having that person for you that can help teach you how to advocate for yourself, I think was pivotal to my experience.
Thank you guys so much for sharing and for your honesty and candor during this entire conversation. I really appreciate it. I feel like I could talk to you guys for hours and hours, but we're at time. So with that, I'm going to throw it to Natalie to close us out.
Sure. Firstly, thank you all so much. This is an amazing conversation. Just, we had over 115 people on the call listening in. Thank you, Kirby, just for navigating and guiding us through this conversation. I want to thank everybody who joined us today, and to the IISBAA members who helped plan this meeting. It's been amazing. I want to make sure that everybody knows how to continue to get involved. So one, I'm putting in this feedback form, but it's also a great way to just drop your information in so that we can get in touch with you. We're also going to throw our website into the chat, which is another way for you to share your information with us, and so that we can get in touch with you so you can get more involved. Please do follow us at Black Interact Alumni on Instagram, and we are also on Facebook. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. It was amazing.